The sun had barely crested the horizon when Elena Vasquez stepped out of her beat-up hatchback, the faint hum of the city waking up around her. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of diesel and damp concrete, as she crossed the parking lot toward Bright Horizons Cafe. It wasn't much to look at, a squat, single-story building with chipped paint and a flickering neon sign that buzzed faintly in the early morning stillness. But to Elena, it was more than just a job. It was a lifeline, a fragile tether to stability after years of scraping by. She adjusted her apron, smoothing out the wrinkles as she pushed through the glass doors. The cafe was quiet, save for the clatter of dishes in the back and the low murmur of the morning crew prepping for the day. Elena had been with Bright Horizons for 3 years, working her way up from dishwasher to lead barista. She wasn't the type to chase promotions or kiss up to management, she just loved the work. The rhythm of steaming milk, the hiss of the espresso machine, the fleeting smiles from customers who left a little happier than they'd arrived. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. That morning, though, something felt off. The air inside was thick with tension, the kind that settles into a room when people are holding their breath. Her coworker, Jamal, a lanky kid with a quick grin, was wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. "You hear about last night?" he muttered as she clocked in. Elena raised an eyebrow, tying her dark hair into a messy bun. "No." "What happened?" Jamal leaned closer, voice low. "Marissa got canned. Right in the middle of the dinner rush." "Marissa?" Elena's stomach dropped. Marissa was one of the good ones, quiet, reliable, always willing to cover a shift. "Why?" "She gave some guy a sandwich. Didn't charge him." Jamal shook his head. "He was just sitting out front, looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Next thing you know, Greg's screaming at her, telling her she's out." "Greg?" The name alone made Elena's jaw tighten. Greg Hensley, the cafe's manager, was a wiry man with a permanent scowl and a temper that flared at the slightest provocation. He'd been running Bright Horizons like his own fiefdom ever since the old owner sold the place to some faceless company 2 years back. Elena had never met the new owner, nobody had, but she'd heard whispers of big changes that never seemed to materialize. Meanwhile, Greg ruled with an iron fist, enforcing rules that made no sense and punishing anyone who dared step out of line. "That's ridiculous," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was just being human. "Yeah, well, Greg doesn't do human," Jamal replied, tossing the rag into a bin. "You know how he is. Rules are rules, and if you break them, you're gone." Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. She'd seen Greg's wrath firsthand, watched him dock pay for a spilled coffee, berate a new hire until they quit, even threatened to fire her once for taking an extra 5 minutes on her break to call her sick grandmother. But firing Marissa over a sandwich? That was a new low, even for him. The morning rush hit hard, as it always did. Commuters streamed in, barking orders for lattes and breakfast sandwiches, their impatience palpable. Elena moved through it all with practiced ease, her hands a blur as she poured, steamed, and plated. But her mind kept drifting back to Marissa. She pictured her standing outside, handing over that sandwich, her soft voice probably saying something kind to the man who'd taken it. Elena knew that feeling, the quiet pull to help someone, even when you weren't supposed to. By mid-morning, the crowd had thinned, and Elena finally got a moment to breathe. She stepped out back to toss a bag of trash, the alley behind the cafe a grim tableau of cracked pavement and overflowing dumpsters. That's when she saw him, a man slumped against the wall, his coat tattered, his face weathered beyond his years. He wasn't begging, wasn't even looking at her. Just sitting there, staring at the ground, a paper cup clutched in his trembling hands. Elena hesitated. She glanced back at the cafe door, half expecting Greg to burst out and catch her slacking. But something in the man's posture, the way his shoulders sagged, the quiet defeat in his stillness, pulled at her. She ducked back inside, grabbed a leftover croissant from the day-old bin, and poured a cup of coffee from the pot that was about to be dumped. It wasn't much, but it was something. When she stepped back out, the man looked up, startled. "Here," she said, holding out the food and drink. "It's on me." He blinked, his eyes cloudy with suspicion, then gratitude. "Thank you," he rasped, taking the offerings with shaky hands. "God bless you." Elena smiled faintly. "Take care, okay?" She didn't wait for a reply. She turned back toward the cafe, her heart a little lighter, until she saw Greg standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his face a mask of fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snapped as she approached. Elena straightened, meeting his glare. He was hungry. "I gave him some leftovers." "It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" Greg's voice rose, sharp enough to cut through the morning air. "You don't get to decide what's a big deal. That's theft, Elena. You're giving away product, my product, without permission." "It was going in the trash anyway," she shot back, her own temper flaring. "What's the harm?" "The harm?" Greg stepped closer, his breath sour with stale coffee. "The harm is you thinking you run this place. You don't." "I do. And I'm done with you bleeding hearts screwing up my system. You're fired. Get your stuff and get out." Elena froze, the words hitting her like a punch. "Fired? For that?" "You heard me," Greg said, already turning away. "Clock out. Now." She stood there, stunned, as he disappeared back inside. The alley felt colder now, the man with the croissant watching her silently from his spot against the wall. Elena's hands clenched into fists, her pulse pounding in her ears. 3 years, 3 years of showing up early, staying late, pouring herself into this place, and it was over, just like that. She stormed back in, grabbed her bag from the break room, and walked out without a word to anyone. Jamal tried to catch her eye, but she couldn't look at him. Not now. The glass doors swung shut behind her, the neon sign buzzing faintly overhead as she crossed the parking lot to her car. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just drove, the city blurring past her windows, her mind a tangle of anger and disbelief. Unbeknownst to her, someone else was watching. Miles away, in a sleek office overlooking the skyline, Victor Langston sat at his desk, a laptop open in front of him. The security footage from Bright Horizons Cafe played on the screen, grainy but clear, Elena handing over the coffee and croissant, Greg's tirade, her exit. Victor's jaw tightened as he watched, his fingers drumming on the polished wood. Victor wasn't your typical CEO. He'd built Langston Ventures from the ground up, turning a single diner into a small empire of cafes and bistros across the state. Bright Horizons was his latest acquisition, a struggling chain he'd bought with the hope of breathing new life into it. He wasn't in it for the money, not entirely. He'd grown up poor, scraping by on handouts and odd jobs, and he'd never forgotten what it felt like to be hungry. That's why he'd poured himself into this business, to create something that fed people, body and soul. But this? This wasn't what he'd signed up for. He'd trusted his regional managers to oversee the day-to-day, kept his distance to focus on the big picture. Clearly, that had been a mistake. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. A worker fired for kindness? A manager so rigid he'd rather toss out good people than bend a rule? This wasn't the company he'd built. He picked up his phone and dialed his operations director, Carla. "I need everything on the Bright Horizons location in Eastside," he said when she answered. "Staff records, financials, security logs. And don't tell anyone I'm asking." Carla hesitated. "You planning a visit?" "Something like that," Victor replied, his voice steady but edged with resolve. "I'm going in myself." Undercover. He hung up before she could argue. By the next morning, he'd traded his tailored suits for a faded hoodie and jeans, his salt and pepper hair hidden under a baseball cap. No one at Bright Horizons knew his face, he'd made sure of that, staying out of the spotlight even as his company grew. To them, he'd be just another new hire, a nobody named Vince. As he pulled into the parking lot, the neon sign buzzing faintly above him, Victor felt a flicker of anticipation. He'd come to see the truth for himself. And if what he suspected was right, he was about to turn this place upside down. The air inside Bright Horizons Cafe hit Victor Langston like a wall, humid, heavy with the mingled scents of burnt coffee grounds and frying bacon. It was his first day as Vince, the new hire, and he felt the weight of every step as he crossed the threshold. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the chipped linoleum floor and the mismatched tables that hadn't been updated since the place was built. He tugged his baseball cap lower, the brim shadowing his sharp gray eyes, and kept his shoulders hunched just enough to blend in. No one spared him a second glance, not the bleary-eyed cashier counting coins at the register, not the cook flipping eggs in the back. Good. Anonymity was his shield. Greg Hensley was waiting near the counter, clipboard in hand, his wiry frame coiled with the restless energy of a man who thrived on control. He barely looked up as Victor approached. "You the new guy?" he barked, his voice cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. "Yeah," Victor said, keeping his tone flat. "Vince." Greg grunted, scribbling something on his clipboard. "You're with Tara today. She'll show you the ropes. Don't screw up, I don't have time to babysit." He jerked his head toward the back, where a woman with tired eyes and a tight ponytail was scrubbing a coffee machine with a rag that looked older than she was. Victor nodded and shuffled over, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the floor. Tara glanced up as he approached, her expression a mix of exhaustion and guarded curiosity. "Hey," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're the fresh meat, huh?" "Guess so," Victor replied, offering a small, disarming smile. "Where do I start?" Tara gestured to a stack of dirty trays beside the sink. "Dish duty. It's not glamorous, but it's where everyone cuts their teeth. Watch out for Greg, though, he'll jump down your throat if he catches you slacking." Victor rolled up his sleeves and got to work, his hands moving with a quiet efficiency that belied his supposed inexperience. He'd washed dishes before, decades ago, in a greasy spoon diner where he'd started as a teenager, scraping by to help his mom pay rent. The rhythm came back to him like muscle memory, scrub, rinse, stack. But his eyes and ears stayed sharp, taking in everything around him. Tara worked beside him, her movements quick but mechanical, like someone who'd long since stopped thinking about what she was doing. She didn't talk much at first, but as the morning wore on, she loosened up. "So, what brings you here?" she asked, glancing at him sideways. "Most people don't stick around long." Victor shrugged, keeping his story simple. "Needed a job. This was open." She snorted softly. "Yeah, well, don't get too comfortable. Greg's got a way of chewing people up and spitting them out. You hear about Marissa?" Victor paused, just for a fraction of a second, before resuming his scrubbing. "No." "What happened?" "Fired her last week for giving some guy a sandwich. Didn't even let her explain, just boom, gone." Tara shook her head, her voice low. "She wasn't the first, either. Last month, he axed a kid for taking an extra break to call his mom in the hospital. Rules are rules, he says. Like we're robots or something." Victor's grip tightened on the sponge, but he kept his face neutral. "Sounds harsh." "Harsh doesn't cover it," Tara muttered. "He's got us on a leash, cuts hours if we complain, docs pay for every little mistake. Half the time, I'm covering shifts just to keep up, and I still barely make rent." The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken, this wasn't a workplace, it was a pressure cooker. Victor filed it away, his mind already turning over what he'd seen on the security footage. Elena's firing had been the spark, but Tara's story painted a broader picture, a culture of fear, enforced by a man who cared more about power than people. The breakfast rush came like a tidal wave, orders piling up faster than the small crew could handle. Victor jumped in where he could, wiping counters, refilling coffee pots, even running plates to tables when the lone server got swamped. He watched Greg through it all, the manager pacing like a predator, barking orders but never lifting a finger to help. At one point, a customer complained about a cold omelet, and Greg snapped at the cook, a wiry kid named Diego, instead of addressing the issue himself. "You think I'm paying you to screw up? Fix it, now." Diego flinched but nodded, his hands trembling as he tossed the plate back on the grill. Victor caught his eye for a moment, saw the frustration simmering there, and felt a pang of guilt. This was his company, his name on the paperwork, and he'd let it rot under men like Greg. By noon, the rush had ebbed, leaving the cafe in a state of controlled chaos. Victor took a break near the back door, sipping water from a chipped mug and pretending to scroll his phone. That's when he saw her, Elena, stepping through the front entrance. She wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a faded jacket, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She moved with purpose, her chin up despite the shadows under her eyes, and headed straight for the counter. Victor edged closer, keeping out of sight behind a stack of crates. He heard her voice, steady but edged with strain. "I'm here for my last paycheck," she said to Tara, who was manning the register. Tara hesitated, glancing toward the back. "Greg's got it. Said he'd mail it, but..." Elena's jaw tightened. "He told me that yesterday. I need it now." Before Tara could respond, Greg emerged from his office, his scowl deepening as he spotted Elena. "What are you doing here?" he snapped, folding his arms. "I told you, you're done." "I just want my paycheck," Elena said, her voice firm. "You owe me for last week." Greg smirked, a cruel twist to his lips. "You'll get it when I'm good and ready. Now get out before I call the cops." Victor's blood ran cold. He'd seen enough petty tyrants in his time to recognize the type. Greg wasn't just enforcing rules, he was reveling in the power to withhold, to punish. Elena stood her ground, her fists clenched at her sides, but before she could reply, Victor stepped forward, his cap still low over his eyes. "She's owed that money," he said, his tone calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "You can't just keep it." Greg whirled on him, eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you to tell me what I can do, new guy? Mind your damn business." Victor held his gaze, unflinching. "It's everyone's business when you're breaking labor laws. Pay her, or this gets messy." The room went still, the few employees nearby exchanging wide-eyed glances. Greg's face flushed red, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For a moment, Victor thought he might swing, but then Elena spoke, cutting through the tension. "Just give it to me, Greg. Let's be done with this." Greg glared at her, then at Victor, before stomping back to his office. He returned a minute later with an envelope, shoving it into Elena's hands. "Take it and go. And you," he jabbed a finger at Victor. "Watch yourself. I don't like troublemakers." Elena didn't say a word as she took the check and walked out, but Victor caught the flicker of gratitude in her eyes as she passed him. He didn't acknowledge it, couldn't, not yet. He turned back to the sink, plunging his hands into the soapy water, his mind racing. Greg's reign was a cancer, spreading through the cafe and choking out anything good. Victor had come to observe, to understand, but now he knew, observation wasn't enough. He'd seen the cracks, overworked staff, ignored customers, a manager who ruled through fear, and he couldn't unsee them. Tomorrow, he'd act. Not as Vince, the dishwasher, but as Victor Langston, the man who owned it all. As the shift dragged on, he worked in silence, the clatter of dishes a steady drumbeat to his thoughts. The cafe was broken, yes, but it wasn't beyond saving. And he'd start with the woman who'd risked her job for a stranger, Elena. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just lit the match that would burn Greg's little kingdom to the ground. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky over Bright Horizons Cafe streaked with clouds that promised rain. Victor Langston pulled into the parking lot just as the first drops began to spatter against his windshield. He sat there for a moment, engine idling, staring at the flickering neon sign through the blur of water. Today was the day. No more hiding, no more playing the part of Vince. He'd seen enough, felt enough, to know that the rot in this place went deeper than one bad manager. It was time to step out of the shadows. He killed the engine, grabbed a plain black umbrella from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the drizzle. Gone was the hoodie and cap, he wore a crisp button-down shirt and slacks now, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his posture straight. The disguise had served its purpose, but it was no longer necessary. As he pushed through the glass doors, the bell above jingled faintly, a sound swallowed by the hum of the cafe waking up. Inside, the morning crew was already at work, Jamal prepping the espresso machine, Tara slicing bagels, Diego flipping bacon on the grill. They moved with the sluggish efficiency of people who'd been ground down too long, their eyes darting toward Greg's office door like prey watching for a predator. Greg himself was at the counter, hunched over his clipboard, muttering to himself as he scratched out numbers with a stubby pencil. He didn't look up as Victor approached, didn't notice the shift in the air, the way the room seemed to hold its breath. "Morning," Victor said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that cut through the background noise. Greg grunted without lifting his head. "Yeah, whatever." "You're late, new guy. Get to the back, N." "I'm not late," Victor interrupted, setting his umbrella against the counter. "And I'm not here to wash dishes." That got Greg's attention. He looked up, eyes narrowing as he took in Victor's appearance, the clothes, the confidence, the lack of deference. "Who the hell are you, then?" he snapped, straightening up. "You don't work here." Victor smiled faintly, a sharp edge to it. "Actually, I do. More than you know." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and flipped it open to reveal a business card. He slid it across the counter with a deliberate flick of his wrist. "Victor Langston. Owner of Langston Ventures. This cafe, and 8 others like it, belongs to me." The words landed like a thunderclap. Greg's face went slack, the pencil slipping from his fingers to clatter against the counter. Around them, the employees froze, Jamal's hand hovering over the espresso tamper, Tara's knife pausing mid-slice, Diego's spatula stilled above the sizzling bacon. The only sound was the faint drip of rain against the windows, a steady counterpoint to the sudden silence. Greg recovered first, his scowl twisting into something defensive. You're the owner," he stammered, then forced a laugh. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but I've been running this place by the book. Corporate rules. Corporate rules don't include firing people for feeding the hungry," Victor said, his voice low and unyielding. "They don't include cutting hours to punish your staff or withholding paychecks out of spite. I've been here 2 days, Greg. I've seen how you run things. And it stops now." Greg's mouth opened, then closed, his face flushing red. "You can't just waltz in here, Anne." "I can," Victor cut in, stepping closer. "And I am." "You're done. Pack your things and leave." The command hung in the air, final and absolute. Greg stared at him, disbelief warring with anger, but Victor didn't blink. He'd dealt with men like this before, bullies who crumbled when their power was stripped away. After a long, tense moment, Greg huffed, snatched his clipboard, and stormed toward the back office, muttering curses under his breath. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the cafe like a gunshot. Victor turned to the staff, who were still watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. "I owe you all an apology," he said, softening his tone. "I should have been here sooner, should have seen what was happening. That's on me. But I'm here now, and things are going to change." Jamal was the first to speak, his voice tentative. "You're really the owner?" Victor nodded. "I am. And I didn't buy this place to let it turn into a sweatshop. You're the backbone of this cafe, every one of you, and you deserve better than what you've been given." Tara set her knife down, crossing her arms. "So what happens now? You fire Greg, but what about us? We're still stretched thin, still barely making it." "Fair question," Victor said. He stepped toward the center of the room, addressing them all. "First, anyone who's had their hours cut unfairly gets them back, full pay, retroactive for the last month. Second, we're hiring more staff. No more running on fumes. And third," he paused, letting the words settle. "I want your input. You know this place better than I do. Tell me what's broken, and we'll fix it together." A murmur rippled through the group, surprise, skepticism, a flicker of hope. Diego spoke up, his voice quiet but steady. "The fryer's been busted for weeks. Greg wouldn't replace it, said we didn't need it. We've been losing customers because we can't keep up." Victor nodded. "Noted. New fryers on the way. What else?" "The schedule," Tara said, her tone sharper now. "Greg kept changing it last minute. Half the time, we didn't know if we were working till the day before." "That ends today," Victor replied. "Stable schedules, posted a week in advance." "Anything else?" Jamal hesitated, then raised a hand. "The coffee supplier. Greg switched to some cheap brand, tastes like burnt dirt. Customers hate it." Victor's lips twitched into a half-smile. "Back to the old supplier. I'll handle it." The exchange felt like a dam breaking, slow at first, then a flood. Complaints and ideas poured out, the broken ice machine, the outdated POS system, the lack of breaks during long shifts. Victor listened, jotting notes on his phone, his mind already mapping out solutions. This wasn't just about fixing equipment or schedules, it was about rebuilding trust, showing them he wasn't just another suit making promises he wouldn't keep. The lunch rush hit soon after, and Victor didn't retreat to an office. He stayed on the floor, jumping in wherever he was needed, running orders, brewing coffee, even scrubbing tables when the lone busboy got overwhelmed. The crew watched him warily at first, but as the hours ticked by, their stiffness eased. He wasn't barking orders like Greg, he was working alongside them, his sleeves rolled up, his hands dirty. It was mid-afternoon when the door jingled again, and Elena walked in. She stopped short, her eyes widening as she took in the scene, Victor behind the counter, Greg nowhere in sight. Tara caught her gaze and waved her over. "You're not gonna believe this," she said, grinning faintly. "This guy's the owner. Fired Greg on the spot." Elena blinked, looking at Victor. "You're him?" "Victor Langston," he said, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped forward. "And you're Elena Vasquez. I saw what happened, the croissant, the argument. You didn't deserve that." She crossed her arms, studying him. "So what's this? You swoop in, play hero, then leave?" "No," Victor said firmly. "I'm here to stay, long enough to get this right. And I want you back, if you'll have it. Not just as a barista, running the place. You've got the heart for it." Elena's expression flickered, surprise, suspicion, then something softer. "Why me?" "Because you cared," Victor said simply. "That's what this place needs. Not rules for the sake of rules, people who give a damn." She didn't answer right away, her gaze drifting to the counter, the crew, the cafe she'd poured 3 years into. Finally, she nodded. Okay. I'm in. Victor smiled, a real one this time. Good. Let's get to work. As the rain tapped against the windows, the cafe hummed with a new energy, not perfect, not yet, but alive. For the first time in years, it felt like a beginning. The rain had stopped by evening, leaving the streets outside Bright Horizons Cafe slick and reflective under the sodium glow of the streetlights. Inside, the last customers had trickled out, their chatter fading into the night, and the crew was winding down, stacking chairs, wiping counters, the quiet clatter of closing time settling over the space. Victor Langston stood near the back, a broom in hand, sweeping up crumbs and coffee grounds from the day's chaos. He hadn't left after the lunch rush, hadn't retreated to some corner office to delegate. He'd stayed, working alongside the team, proving with every scrubbed table and refilled sugar jar that he meant what he'd said. Things were changing. Elena Vasquez tied her apron back on, her movements deliberate as she took stock of the prep station. She'd agreed to return, not just as a barista, but as the cafe's new manager, though the weight of that decision still sat heavy on her shoulders. She wasn't sure she trusted Victor yet, not fully. He'd fired Greg, promised reforms, but promises were cheap. She'd heard them before, from landlords, from bosses, from people who swore they'd make things right only to vanish when the hard part came. Still, there was something in his eyes, a quiet resolve that made her want to believe. The crew gathered in the dining area after the doors were locked, their faces a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. Victor set the broom aside and joined them, pulling up a chair. "All right," he said, his voice steady but warm. "First day of the new normal. How'd it feel?" Jamal leaned back, crossing his arms. "Better without Greg breathing down our necks, that's for sure. Orders went out faster, customers noticed." "Yeah," Tara added, her tone less guarded than before. "Had a lady say it's the first time her latte didn't taste like regret. Guess the old coffee's a hit." Victor chuckled, nodding. "Good. That's the baseline, decent coffee, decent service. We build from there." He glanced at Elena. "What about you? First shift back, what do you see?" Elena hesitated, then spoke. "We're still short-handed. Even with you pitching in, we barely kept up during the rush. And the stock room's a mess, half the stuff's expired because Greg never rotated it." "Fair," Victor said, pulling out his phone to jot it down. "More hires are priority one, I've got ads going out tomorrow. As for the stock room, let's tackle it tonight. Anyone who stays gets overtime pay, double rate." A ripple of surprise passed through the group. Diego raised an eyebrow. "Double? You serious?" "Dead serious," Victor replied. "You've been running on empty too long. If we're fixing this, we're doing it right, and that means valuing your time." The promise of overtime, and the fact that Victor stayed to help, shifted the mood. The crew split up, some heading home, others diving into the stock room with a vigor they hadn't shown in months. Elena led the charge, sorting through dusty boxes of stale pastries and rancid creamers, her hands quick and sure. Victor worked beside her, hauling trash bags and breaking down cardboard, his shirt sleeves rolled up past his elbows. They didn't talk much at first, the task consuming their focus, but as the hours ticked by, she broke the silence. "Why'd you pick me?" she asked, pausing with a jar of pickles in hand, expiration date 2 years past. "You don't even know me." Victor set a crate down, wiping sweat from his brow. "I know enough. I saw the footage, you didn't hesitate to help that guy, even knowing Greg might catch you. That's instinct, not calculation. This place needs someone who leads with that." Elena studied him, searching for a lie in his words. She didn't find one, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down. "Instinct got me fired. And it got you back, Victor countered. With a better job. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you. It did for me, too, back when I was starting out. But it's worth it in the end. She didn't press him for details, just nodded and went back to sorting. By midnight, the stock room was transformed, shelves organized, inventory logged, a fresh start carved out of the chaos. The crew who'd stayed, Tara, Diego, and Jamal, headed out with tired smiles and heavier pockets, leaving Victor and Elena alone in the quiet cafe. He locked the back door, then turned to her. First thing tomorrow, I'm meeting with suppliers, coffee, food, equipment. You're with me. Pick what works for this place, not just what's cheap. Elena blinked. Me? I'm not. You are, Victor said firmly. You know what the customers want, what the team needs. I'm not here to guess, I'm here to listen. The next few days blurred into a whirlwind of action. Elena sat in on meetings, her voice growing steadier as she pushed for quality over cost, fresh produce, local roasts, a new fryer that didn't spit grease like a volcano. Victor backed her every step, his authority cutting through red tape with a precision that surprised her. New hires trickled in, 2 baristas, a cook, a busboy, easing the strain on the crew. Schedules stabilized, posted a week out, and the cafe began to hum with a rhythm it hadn't known in years. It was a week later when the real test came. A man shuffled in during the afternoon lull, his clothes patched, his hands rough from a life outdoors. He lingered near the counter, eyes flicking to the menu, then to his empty pockets. Elena saw him from the prep station and felt that familiar pull, the same one that had gotten her fired. This time, though, she didn't hesitate. She stepped up, smiling softly. Hey, what can I get you? Just water, he mumbled, head down. How about a sandwich, too, she said, already reaching for the bread. On the house. The man looked up, startled, then grateful. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick. Victor watched from the back, a quiet pride in his chest. He'd told Elena the policy, anyone who needed a meal got one, no questions, but seeing her act on it, without fear, was proof the change was real. She handed the man his food, and as he shuffled to a table, she caught Victor's eye. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement, this is what we're here for. That night, after closing, Victor gathered the crew again. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and warm bread, a far cry from the stale grease of a week ago. You've all done something incredible, he said, looking at each of them, Jamal, Tara, Diego, the new faces, and Elena at the helm. This isn't my win, it's yours. I'm stepping back soon, but I'm not disappearing. Elena's in charge now, and I trust her to keep this going. Elena straightened, the responsibility settling into her bones. We're not done, she said, her voice firm. Better hours, better food, that's just the start. I want this place to feel like home, for us and the customers. The crew nodded, a quiet resolve binding them. Victor stepped outside as they dispersed, the cool night air washing over him. He looked up at the neon sign, still flickering, but brighter now, and felt a weight lift. He'd come to fix a broken cafe, but he'd found something more, a team worth believing in, a purpose worth fighting for. Elena joined him, her jacket zipped against the chill. You're really leaving? For now, Victor said. But I'll check in. This is your show, I'm just the guy who got it started. She smiled, small but real. Thanks. For seeing me. Always, he replied, tipping his head. Keep the light on, Elena. As he walked to his car, the cafe glowed behind him, a beacon in the dark, rebuilt not just with money or rules, but with heart. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. And for Victor, for Elena, for everyone inside, that was enough.